Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Millward, the CEO and Executive Director of the Animal Welfare Institute, and I want to thank you all for joining us today. AWI is very grateful for the support you've shown our organization. We are especially thankful that so many of you have taken up the cause. Your advocacy is a critical component of our recent victories on behalf of animals. Together, we've achieved passage of important animal welfare laws, including the Big Cat Public Safety Act and the Shark Fin Sales Elimination Act. We've strengthened local protections for critically endangered species, such as the Atlantic humpback dolphin and the pygmy three-toed sloth, and much more. Today, you'll hear about some of these wins, as well as critical legislative, administrative, and legal actions for the year ahead. During the next hour, AWI staff will provide an overview of major animal welfare laws in the United States, discuss our goals for the year, and outline how you can get involved. We are optimistic that, notwithstanding bipartisan politics, there are areas of agreement in support of animal welfare, and we look forward to pursuing those opportunities with your support. Now, let me introduce the speakers. First, you will hear about the Animal Welfare Act from Nancy Blaney, Director of AWI's Government Affairs Program. Next, Johanna Hamburger and Georgia Hancock, attorneys and directors of our terrestrial wildlife and marine wildlife programs, will speak about the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. After that, you will hear about the National Environmental Policy Act from DJ Schubert, Senior Wildlife Biologist, and then the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act from attorney Zach Strong, Director of our Farmed Animal Program. Senior Policy Advisor, Dr. Joanna Grossman, will then provide an overview of laws we may have to defend in 2025. While Kate Delusky, Assistant Director of Government Affairs, will cover some of AWI's proactive legislative efforts in the year ahead. Finally, Kim Menio, AWI's Digital Engagement Manager, will provide an overview of tools available to you to help us progress our goals within our online action center. We will close with a question and answer session. Questions can be submitted anytime during the webinar using the Q&A function in your Zoom toolbar. Now I'll hand over to Nancy to talk about the Animal Welfare Act.
Thank you, Susan, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. We here in government affairs, as you know, face a number of challenges due to the anti-regulatory direction that the current administration and the current Congress are taking. So we have our work cut out for us. But I want to talk to you a little bit about what we're going to do to help defend the Animal Welfare Act. And I think most of you are very familiar with this law. It is the premier law that protects animals used for a number of commercial activities, most notably animals who are in puppy mills, in exhibits such as zoos and circuses, and also used in research. But there are a number of threats to this act that we depend on so much in order to protect the many animals that we see in our lives. The most pressing threat that we're aware of is the failure to fund. Basically just cutting off money for the enforcement of laws. And that's the most devastating act that the Congress could take in order to not have this law be enforced effectively. We want to make sure that it is funded properly. Or Congress could prohibit the use of funds for certain enforcement activities. So one thing that we are looking to make sure is that the USDA is not directing its inspectors not to do their enforcement, not to make inspections, not to write things up that they find, to discourage inspectors from doing their jobs, and possibly going back to a much maligned tool that was used a few years ago called teachable moments, which is basically telling a licensee to clean things up and we won't write you up. And that not only doesn't provide a history of what is going on there, but it also doesn't let the public know what's going on. There could also be the failure to fill vacancies. There are always vacancies within the enforcement division at USDA for the Animal Welfare Act, and we want to make sure that it is staffed as fully as it can be. And then there can be new personnel who will come on board who subscribe to the anti-regulatory mindset that seems to be quite prevalent in Washington today. So we want to guard against that. So how do we respond? Well, we certainly are already starting to work with members of Congress on appropriations requests. So we put in our requests for funding for the Animal Welfare Act so that it's fully funded, and so that the funding, that there aren't any sort of tags along with it that would keep it from going where it needs to go. We enlist support from individual members of the House and Senate for sufficient appropriations. And while bipartisanship has had a little bit of trouble getting traction in the current Congress, I'm happy to say that support for funding for Animal Welfare Act has tended to be a very bipartisan effort. So we're hopeful that that will continue. And then, of course, it comes to you, where we enlist your support to encourage your members to support adequate funding and staffing for the Animal Welfare Act. But these are not the only issues that we are facing. There are other problems with the Animal Welfare Act that we need to fix. There have been persistent problems with lax enforcement over the years, and sadly, this has cut across many Congresses and many administrations. USDA changed its licensing regime from annual relicensing to only licensing every 3 years. So this has made things worse instead of better. There are fewer eyes on fewer times on all of these licensees. So bad actors have been able to stay in business far longer than they should. You may all be familiar with the Envigo case of a year or two ago. A breeder of dogs for use in research, over 4,000 animals had to be rehomed from this place because USDA had so long let it go, let problems persist, allowed inhumane conditions to persist, where finally the Department of Justice had to step in, as did animal welfare organizations, to help rehome these animals. USDA fails to confiscate suffering animals. So that has been an enduring problem, where they may write up inhumane conditions, but animals stay in those inhumane conditions. But there are options for us to respond. Animal Welfare Institute has been working with members of Congress on the Animal Welfare Enforcement Improvement Act, which will be reintroduced. This will close some of the loopholes that we have identified in the enforcement of the Animal Welfare Act to make it stronger. And there are other bills that we will support that will help to improve conditions for animals who are in licensed facilities, as well as making sure that animals who are suffering get removed from those conditions. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Nancy. Moving on, I'd love to introduce Johanna, who's going to talk about the Endangered Species Act. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Susan, and thank you all very much for joining us. The Endangered Species Act is the world's most powerful and our most successful conservation statute, and it's one that's really, truly critical to the work that AWI does. The goal of the ESA is to prevent species from going extinct, and it does that by providing a framework to recover populations by conserving ecosystems that species depend on. It was passed in 1973 with broad bipartisan support, and there are 2 federal agencies that are responsible for implementing the ESA, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as NOAA Fisheries, otherwise known as the National Marine Fisheries Service, or NMFS. To receive ESA protections, a species first must be listed as either endangered, so that means that the species is at risk of extinction, or it can be listed as threatened, meaning the species is likely to become endangered. The 2 services are responsible for determining when a species qualifies for listing, and that's based on any one of the 5 factors that you can see up here on the screen. The ESA currently protects around 2,400 species, and that includes both U.S. domestic species as well as foreign species. The services are also responsible for designating critical habitats. So those are areas that are essential for the species conservation, and Congress deemed this to be really the crux of the statute and critical for the recovery of species populations. Once a species has been listed, those animals are protected from take. So that includes killing, wounding, harassing, all of the actions that you can see up here on the screen. And then all federal agencies have the additional duty of ensuring that their actions are not likely to threaten the existence of a listed species or harm the species' critical habitat. AWI's terrestrial and marine programs make use of all of the protections I just talked about to help save species. And to give a few examples, the terrestrial program has successfully litigated to save the red wolf from extinction in the wild. We've petitioned to list the pygmy three-toed sloth as endangered, as threatened, and we've collaborated to support disease control to protect Hawaiian honeycreepers. Abroad, we focus on limiting the trade of listed species under CITES, or the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, which the US implements through the ESA. And we've also advocated against the use of imports of the live African elephants through that trade. And we also work to ban the import of sport hunted trophies of listed species. The Marine Wildlife Program also uses the ESA to advocate for North Atlantic right whales, Florida manatees, southern resident killer whales, and Rice's whales, to name a few. Outside the US, the Marine Program works to save critically endangered vaquitas, and AWI has successfully petitioned to have the Taiwanese white dolphin and Atlantic humpback dolphin listed as endangered, and they've opposed a petition to delist southern sea otters as well. AWI also works to protect the ESA from congressional and administrative rollbacks. In terms of congressional rollbacks, the ESA is one of the most highly targeted conservation statutes. Last Congress, we saw 115 separate attacks on the ESA, and many of those same bills or amendments have already been reintroduced this Congress. To give you an example of a few of the things that we've been seeing, we have seen bills that would allow the government to delist species, even if they don't meet the legal threshold. We have bills that would delist or prevent the listing of specific species, and amendments that would establish a penalty for those like AWI who petitioned to list species under the statute. The ESA also experienced extensive regulatory rollbacks under the first Trump administration. As a few examples, those regulations curtailed protections for threatened species. They allowed economic information to be considered in listing decisions, which is not permissible under the statute. They limited critical habitat designations, restricted input from experts, and also limited consideration of the impacts of climate change. Fortunately, the Biden administration did partially restore those regulations, but we're expecting the same rollbacks to occur again under the current Trump administration, and we expect those rollbacks to likely be even more damaging this time around and to occur even more quickly. These attacks are coming despite the fact that the ESA is more important now than ever. We have 1 million species globally that are at risk of extinction in the upcoming decades, and the ESA truly is the best tool that we have to address that. So in terms of what you can do, we have a couple of upcoming actions that you can take to protect threatened and endangered species. After the webinar, you'll be receiving an email about how you can use AWI's Action Alert Center to contact your senators about the Fix Our Forests Act, which would slash wildlife protection under the ESA. And next Tuesday, please do be on the lookout for an email about contacting your members of Congress, encouraging them to vote against legislative attacks on the ESA. So thanks very much, and we're looking forward to partnering with you to protect imperiled species going forward. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Johanna. A lot to pack in. Now we're going to move to Georgia, who's going to speak about the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Georgia.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you all for being here today. Marine mammals play vital roles in marine ecosystems, yet given that marine mammals generally live their lives beyond the vantage point of most humans, Congress recognized that these animals were particularly difficult to study, and that unless it intervened, these species and populations could be decimated by human activities before anyone might notice. Thus, in a bipartisan vote of Congress in 1972, the Marine Mammal Protection Act set the global standard for protecting marine mammals and their ecosystems, with the goal of ensuring their populations are recovered and preserved long into the future. With certain exceptions, the MMPA established a moratorium or a ban on the taking of marine mammals and the importation of marine mammals or their products into the U.S. Similarly to the ESA, the take prohibition in the MMPA means that it is illegal for humans to harass, hunt, capture, or kill marine mammals, or to attempt to do any of those things without a federal permit. Unintentional harm, such as entanglement in fishing gear, known as bycatch, is also regulated pursuant to the MMPA. The MMPA is jointly administered by the same two federal agencies as the ESA. So within the Department of Commerce's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA Fisheries, also known as the National Marine Fisheries Service, or NMFS, is responsible for administering the law with respect to cetaceans, which include whales, dolphins, and porpoises, as well as pinnipeds, except for walruses, so seals and sea lions. Within the Department of the Interior, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible for overseeing the law with respect to walruses, polar bears, sea otters, manatees, and dugongs. In addition, the MMPA established the Marine Mammal Commission, an independent federal agency that is responsible for overseeing the implementation of this law. Some of the key provisions of the MMPA include, as mentioned, a prohibition on the take or import of marine mammals or their products, and the requirement of a permit for activities that may affect marine mammals, like scientific research, enhancement, or public display. The MMPA also includes a mandate that the agencies, through implementation of the law, work to recover species and populations that have become depleted. Species and populations are considered depleted if they are below their optimum sustainable population, which means that the number of animals that will maximize the productivity of a species while maintaining the health of the marine ecosystem. Now, I could easily spend all my time talking about the MMPA and fisheries bycatch, but for the sake of time, I'll just note that the pre-1994 MMPA system tried to address bycatch through waivers and general permits, but these proved to be inefficient and difficult to enforce. In what was known as the fish fix, the 1994 amendments replaced the waiver and general permit system with a more structured and science-driven regulatory approach involving an incidental take and authorization system, take reduction plans and teams, and mandatory observer programs and reporting requirements. This led to a better management of bycatch and improved conservation outcomes while making compliance more feasible for fisheries. The MMPA has proven to be remarkably effective. No marine mammal species in the U.S. has gone extinct since the law was enacted. The MMPA has helped recover species like the northern elephant seal, humpback whale, and California sea lion. Collaboration between scientists, agencies, NGOs, and local communities has been instrumental to these recoveries. Between 1972 and 1994, the MMPA played a strong role with respect to captive marine mammals. But in 1994, Congress amended the law substantially, removing many of the provisions that benefited captive marine mammals and transferring the bulk of their oversight to USDA APHIS. For example, following the 1994 amendments, the MMPA no longer applied to actions that would qualify as harassment after removal from the wild. While the MMPA has been incredibly successful, bycatch, ship strikes, underwater noise, marine pollution, and climate change still pose threats to marine mammals and their habitats. AWI advocates for laws, regulations, and policies to tackle these challenges. In the current political climate, we may be in the position of needing to defend the MMPA. In the past, we've seen harmful amendments to the MMPA proposed by the oil and gas sector and the Navy. It's possible that we'll see similar attacks this time around, in addition to legislation concerning commercial fisheries. We can also expect to see harmful budget cuts for myriad federal programs that benefit marine mammals and their habitats. We hope you'll join us in advocating for pro-welfare and pro-wildlife conservation policies and promoting public awareness as we move forward. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Georgia. Now, DJ will talk about the National Environmental Policy Act. And thank you for your questions. Keep them coming.
Thank you, Susan. Guessing I'm on screen. Thank you, Susan, and welcome everyone to this important webinar. I am going to introduce you to the National Environmental Policy Act. If you're not aware of this act, I think you'll find this general overview to be quite interesting, and it will explain to you the importance of this law. The National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, is the national charter for the protection of our environment. It was passed by Congress in 1969 and signed into law by President Nixon in 1970. It's got many purposes, but the primary purpose is to promote efforts which will prevent or eliminate damage to the environment and biosphere, to fulfill the responsibility of each generation as trustee of the environment for succeeding generations. Now, if you're concerned about wildlife, if you're concerned about air and water quality, public health, environmental justice, climate change, NEPA is an important law for you. There are several components of NEPA that make it a valuable tool to use in our advocacy. And some of them are listed on this page, including the fact that agencies have to engage in informed decision-making. They have to examine the environmental impacts of major federal actions before the actions are implemented, or in other words, look before they leap. They have to utilize high-quality information and accurate scientific analyses in engaging in those assessments. They must consider a reasonable range of alternatives to examine different options that would prevent or mitigate impacts to our environment. And this information must be transparent. They need to share it with the public. And most importantly, we all, as members of the public, have an opportunity to engage in the decision-making process. Now, how is NEPA implemented? Well, NEPA is triggered by major federal actions affecting the quality of the environment. Those are actions that are primarily under the responsibility of the federal government. There are 3 different levels of NEPA review. Environmental impact statements are the most comprehensive of the assessment tools. Those are often applicable to oil and gas development, logging, and mining activities. Environmental assessments are a more concise version of an environmental impact statement. Interestingly, agencies can use environmental assessments to determine if an environmental impact statement is applicable to a particular major federal action. Environmental assessments are often applicable or often used by federal agencies that develop wildlife management plans on National Park Service lands or on national wildlife refuges. And frequently, environmental assessments are used to assess the impacts of wild horse roundups, as 2 examples. The last level of NEPA review is called the categorical exclusion. That's used for the types of projects that are not supposed to have a significant impact on the quality of the environment. I would note that all agency decisions under NEPA, including a decision to use a categorical exclusion, are subject to judicial review. In terms of the types of impacts that are evaluated, if you've never reviewed an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement, some of the types of issues that are frequently assessed in those documents would be wildlife and wildlife protection, biodiversity, animal welfare, air and water quality, habitat protection, ecosystem function, climate change, environmental justice, and cultural and historical resources. Every EA and EIS is different. And so there are instances where different types of impact factors that may be considered that are not on this page. In terms of how AWI uses NEPA to protect animals and how you can use NEPA to protect animals. First, we often engage with agencies by submitting informed and substantive comments on agency proposals. These could include environmental assessments that the USDA Wildlife Services publishes that for the lethal and non-lethal control of wildlife. Those assessments pertain to mountain lions, bears, wolves, skunks, foxes, and many other species. We have submitted comments to the National Park Service on their plans to manage bison, Yellowstone bison, for example, white-tailed deer in Valley Forge and Rock Creek Park, and Canada geese. For the Fish and Wildlife Service, if you live near a national wildlife refuge, the Fish and Wildlife Service uses environmental assessments whenever they want to establish hunting or trapping on those refuges. And NEPA provides you an opportunity to participate in that process and explain why you oppose those types of activities. For the National Marine Fisheries Service, we have submitted comments on whales, various species, and sea turtles. And for the Bureau of Land Management, we've submitted comments, substantive comments on wild horses, horse and burro management. Again, just to note, and this is quite important, agency decisions are subject to review by federal courts, and AWI has used the courts to question or challenge decisions that we don't believe are based on the best available scientific evidence. Now, there are a number of threats to NEPA, and NEPA is not only threatened by Republican or Democratic administrations, it's threatened by both. Over the years, NEPA has been subject to bipartisan attacks by members of Congress, largely to benefit corporations and extractive industries. A number of bills have already been introduced in this Congress with the intent to weaken NEPA. Some of the threats that we are likely to see based on the first Trump administration, and we anticipate will come back perhaps with even greater severity, would be efforts to rescind or weaken the regulations, the NEPA implementing regulations, exempt actions from NEPA review, narrow the scope of NEPA reviews by, for example, establishing page limits or timeframes for such reviews, weaken the evaluation of impacts by limiting what types of issues agencies have to consider in their assessments, and limit opportunities for public input, which obviously affects us as AWI and you as concerned members of the public. These attacks will lead to poor agencies' decisions that will harm our environment. It will contribute to less government accountability and transparency, cause habitat destruction and biodiversity loss, adverse impacts to threatened and endangered species, air and water quality, and public health, and it will remove your voice in the decision-making process. So we, as AWI, will be working diligently in the halls of Congress through administrative processes like submitting comments to agencies and in the courts to protect NEPA. And we welcome your support and your involvement in those efforts by monitoring or by looking out for action alerts that AWI will distribute over the next months and years, where we will provide guidance and instruction for how you can help us defend this very important law. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, DJ. Now Zach will talk about the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act.
Thanks, Susan. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk about a federal law that helps protect farmed animals called the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, or HMSA. This is a law that requires that the slaughtering of livestock and the handling of livestock in slaughter plants be done using, quote, humane methods. The law defines humane methods of slaughter as those that are rapid and effective and that render animals insensible to pain by a single blow or gunshot or by an electrical, chemical, or other means. And in addition, USDA regulations implementing the law also prohibit certain forms of abuse, such as beating livestock with pipes or pointed objects, excessive use of electric prods, and dragging disabled animals. The HMSA is far from perfect. One of its major shortcomings is that the USDA has interpreted it to apply only to mammalian livestock, such as cattle and pigs, and not to avian animals, such as chickens and turkeys, which means the law only covers about 2% of the nearly 10 billion animals we raise and kill for food each year. Nonetheless, the HMSA is important because it's one of the only federal statutes we have that offers some meaningful protections for farmed animals. And in fact, other than the federal organic standards, which my colleague Joanna Grossman will discuss in more detail, There are no federal laws that protect animals while they are on farms, and the only federal law that regulates animal welfare during transport is unfortunately riddled with exceptions and rarely enforced. The silver lining to this relative lack of federal protections for farmed animals is that we don't experience quite as many congressional efforts to undermine farmed animal laws as our colleagues do for other species like wildlife. So in the coming year and beyond, we don't anticipate needing to do as much HMSA defensive work as we anticipate working to try to strengthen HMSA enforcement. And so there are a number of ways that we will work to do that. Here are 3 examples. So first, we closely monitor USDA slaughter records, and when we see repeated instances of egregious abuse, we will pressure the USDA to permanently suspend its inspection of those slaughter plants. This is a step that USDA has occasionally taken in the past and can serve as a way to prevent at least the plants that are the repeat offenders from continuing to operate. Second, and again, when we see evidence of severe mistreatment in slaughter plants, we will alert local law enforcement officials and request that they investigate and pursue criminal charges against the plant and/or plant managers under state animal cruelty laws. Every state has anti-cruelty laws, and while many of them exempt routine farming practices, they don't tend to exempt the types of actions prohibited by the HMSA, such as beating animals and excessively prodding them. And then third, we'll consider litigation. So, for example, a couple of years ago, we petitioned the USDA to take steps to ensure that its slaughter plant inspectors are able to observe pigs while they're being stunned with CO2 gas to make sure they're being slaughtered in compliance with the HMSA. And so if the USDA fails to respond to that petition or others that we've filed or arbitrarily denies them, we'll consider filing legal challenges. Finally, related to the HMSA and to slaughter more broadly, we'll be keeping an eye out for federal legislation that would expand a practice called custom exempt slaughter. So custom slaughter is when animals are killed for personal or household consumption and not offered for sale to the public. This type of slaughter is largely exempt from federal inspection. During the past several Congresses, legislation called the Prime Act has been introduced that would allow custom exempt meat to be sold to retailers such as restaurants and grocery stores within the same state. This would have the effect of greatly expanding the market for custom slaughtered meat and increase the number of animals killed without inspection, which would likely lead to a higher number of unreported instances of abuse. So if we see the Prime Act or any similar legislation reintroduced again this Congress, we'll certainly work to oppose it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zach. Now Joanna will give us an overview of laws we may have to defend in 2025.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I wanted to touch on a few other laws and regulations where we could see efforts to undermine important safeguards. I'm AWI's Equine Program Director, so I want to start with the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act, which was passed to preserve our nation's wild equines. The Bureau of Land Management is the agency primarily tasked with managing these herds, yet the BLM has historically relied on brutal helicopter roundups to remove horses from the range. Over 68,000 wild equines are currently in off-range holding, which comes at enormous taxpayer expense. National polling shows overwhelming support for protecting horses, both wild and domestic. But because gaps exist in the 1971 law, we fight to maintain annual appropriations language that prevents both lethal control and selling wild horses into slaughter. This is especially critical as some lawmakers and special interests support pursuing such avenues. Project 2025 included a section on wild horses that called for euthanizing these animals. So upholding protections in appropriations bills and advancing directives to reform the BLM's management is a top priority. We are also working to protect wild horses in the courts. With 2 other nonprofits, we filed a lawsuit against the BLM in response to its plan to eliminate millions of acres of designated habitat in Wyoming, despite the agency acknowledging these areas can sustain healthy herds. And we were previously successful in litigation to stop the BLM from performing inhumane and risky surgical sterilizations on wild horses. Next, I want to turn to the Horse Protection Act, which was designed to combat abusive practices known as soring. Soring entails deliberately inflicting pain on a horse's hooves and legs to elicit a high-stepping gait for competition. These abuses are associated with Tennessee walking horses and include applying caustic chemicals to burn their flesh, inserting hard objects into tender soles, using chains to strike against sore areas, and more. Comprehensive regulations to protect horses from soring were slated to go into effect on February 1st, but have now been delayed. USDA sought to replace the broken industry-run inspection regime whereby shows appoint inspectors to identify violations, essentially a fox guarding the henhouse scenario. The HPA rule was widely supported by members of the public, members of Congress, animal protection organizations, the veterinary community, and equine industry groups. However, certain lawmakers, agricultural interests, and the Tennessee walking horse industry have opposed these reforms. Moreover, in 2017, the Trump administration froze a prior iteration of these regulations. On January 31st, a U.S. district court issued a ruling on a lawsuit brought by the Tennessee walking horse industry that found USDA had exceeded its statutory authority in some aspects of the regulations, but that USDA's efforts to replace the current inspection system is lawful and can proceed. It's critical to keep pressure on USDA so they move forward with implementation. Switching gears to farmed animals, the organic poultry and livestock standards were finalized in 2023. This was a significant victory as these regulations represent the only federal standards for the raising of farmed animals in the United States, and they improve the welfare of millions of animals nationwide. The Trump administration withdrew a prior iteration of these standards in 2018, and we have seen congressional attempts to block them, so we're cognizant that we may see efforts to revoke these standards. Finally, I wanted to flag the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which protects over 1,000 species. The first Trump administration issued a rule that flew in the face of longstanding legal interpretation by eliminating responsibility to avoid the incidental killing of birds, which often occurs in relation to industrial practices. For example, birds being poisoned by pesticides or birds perishing in chemical and oil pits. The Biden administration restored protections, but there is ample reason to be concerned that the MBTA will be targeted again. Unfortunately, greenlighting the incidental killing of migratory birds would likely lead to millions of them dying. So as with the other examples I highlighted, we are working to ensure strong protections remain in place. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Joanna. Moving on, Kate will talk about AWI's proactive legislative efforts in the year ahead.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being with us today. So my colleagues have been talking about a lot of defensive actions and strategy that AWI will be engaging on. But I want to take the opportunity to talk about some really good bills that we're going to be working on in the next year. And I want to share these with you as a reminder that there are always opportunities to make progress, even if that progress is sometimes slow. So I'm going to mention these bills very briefly due to time constraints, but there's more information about these bills on our website, and we're also happy to take questions about them after the presentations. So on the federal level in Congress, the first bill I want to touch on is the Save America's Forgotten Equines Act, or the SAFE Act. This is a bill AWI has worked on for a long time that would prohibit the slaughter of horses in the United States for human consumption, and also prohibit the export of live horses for that same purpose. And we're working really hard to try and get this incorporated into some larger legislative vehicles that will hopefully be moving in the next year. Next, I want to mention the Child and Animal Abuse Detection and Reporting Act. This bill would require that data collected by the federal government from state child protection agencies include information about animal abuse as a risk factor for child abuse. And by doing this, it would help identify opportunities to prevent both child and animal abuse and suggest when more specialized interventions could be helpful. Next, we have the Opposing the Cultivation and Trade of Octopus Produced Through Unethical Strategies Act, or the Octopus Act, which is a great acronym. This bill would prohibit the commercial farming of octopus in the United States, which would prevent any octopus farming facilities from opening in this country. It would also prohibit the importation of commercially farmed octopus. Next, we have the Developing Alternative Mitigation Systems for Beavers Act, or Dams for Beavers Act. And what this bill would do is invest money in human beaver coexistence. It would establish a federal grant program that would fund the use of non-lethal devices to deal with instances where human communities and beavers building their dams may come into conflict so that nobody is using traps or other lethal methods. Next, we have the Strengthening Welfare in Marine Settings Act, or SWIMS Act. And this bill would phase out the captivity of larger cetaceans like orcas and beluga whales, which would ensure ultimately that they would no longer be on public display for entertainment. And the final piece of federal legislation I want to mention is the Captive Primate Safety Act. And this bill would end the pet primate trade in the United States, making sure that none of these wild animals are kept in homes anymore to protect both the primates and also the communities and first responders that are impacted by escapes and attacks. So after that very fast run through of some federal legislation, moving right along to some topics that we're working on the state level. A lot of these topics, there are multiple bills across several states. And again, happy to provide more information after. But some of the bills that we are working on or supporting include ones that would, for example, restrict mink farming and also to ban the sale of new fur products to reduce the fur trade. Bills to expand prohibitions on exotic pet ownership, to end wildlife killing contests, to strengthen coordination between law enforcement efforts that are related to domestic abuse and to animal abuse, several farmed animal issues, including improving standards by prohibiting practices like gestation crates or battery cages, or updating fire safety codes to help prevent or mitigate barn fires, or reforming aquaculture practices like prohibiting net pen fish farming. We're also working on several bills that would prohibit the use of wild animals in traveling shows. So after that very quick run through, I just want to emphasize that to make progress on all of these critical issues, it's so important that lawmakers hear from you frequently and consistently. So for ways to engage in that outreach, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Kim.
Thank you, Kate. So by now you've heard action alerts mentioned a few times during this webinar, and I'm here to tie it all together and provide an overview of some of the types of actions we may be asking you to take in the near future. Firstly, our most frequent type of action is a direct letter, where we ask advocates to contact their legislators or other influential individuals around the world. These letters are then sent individually to the recipient's email inbox. Secondly, AWI's Action Center allows advocates to comment on the development of federal regulations issued by the US government. After completing your information within the Action Center and submitting your comment, it will be published to regulations.gov as public comment. On the next slide, we have examples of both of these action alerts. The top screenshot showcases a direct letter action in AWI's Action Center, while the bottom screenshot shows a comment published to regulations.gov. Next, we have petition-based action alerts. These are similar to our letter action alerts. However, advocates are asked to sign their name to a predetermined letter. All signatures are then compiled by AWI and delivered in one batch to the intended recipient. Additionally, state-level action alerts are a great way to get involved at a more local level. As urgent matters arise, AWI may offer each of these types of alerts: message, petition, and regulatory comment at the state level. Within each action, we provide additional tools to help amplify your voice, such as calling your legislator's office, sending a physical letter in the mail, and connecting with them via social media. On this slide here, you see an example of a petition that we sent with advocate signatures included at the bottom of the letter. You may feel as though your voice cannot make a difference as you are just one person, but please know that together, our collective voices are heard, and when legislators receive communications from their constituents, they do listen. Within the Action Center, we have several additional ways to make your voice heard. We encourage you all to share our action alerts with your friends and family, whether by forwarding our emails, posting on social media, or sharing by word of mouth. You can also look up your local and federal legislators, learn more about them, and view their voting record. Our media tab allows you to research local newspapers and submit letters to the editor about issues that are important to you. I hope you found this overview helpful, and now I'm going to turn it back over to Susan for the Q&A portion of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have a bunch of questions that have come in and only 13 minutes, so I'm going to group some of them. And there was a few, one directly related to Kim, your presentation, but I'm going to give it to Kate if that's okay. It's a question that says, my senators and congresspeople probably do not even see the requests I make on my own or through emails I sign from AWI. How do I get the attention of those individuals rather than just their support staff? So how can you really get senators and Congress people's attention?
It's a great question. It might not feel like your voice is being heard when you hit submit and send in an email, or when you pick up the phone and make a call to your legislator's office. But for those of us on the government affairs team, we are talking to folks in Hill offices every single day. And so often what we hear from these staffers is that the number one issue that their office is receiving feedback on is animal welfare. And that makes an impact. It makes it more likely that their office is going to pay attention to the bills that they're being contacted about. It really raises our issues up on their priority list. And so it might just feel like your voice is a drop in the bucket, but it truly does matter. And it does help us as an organization advance our priorities in the legislature.
Thank you, Kate. I hope that answered your question. If not, please follow up by email, and I'll give you that email address at the end. We have a few questions on farmed animals. So Zach, I'm hoping that you can maybe answer these together. One was, is there any update on abuse at dairy farms? And how is farmed animal cruelty evidence gathered? So those are two right off the bat, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, let me take a stab at those. Well, related to animal abuse on dairy farms, of course, as with other types of factory farms, serious abuse and mistreatment occurs on dairy farms. Anything from animals, being beaten, animals are intensively confined. Some of these operations actually have thousands of dairy cows in them. And related to the dairy industry, of course, are the calves that are taken from their mothers at birth so that the milk can be consumed by people rather than the calves. And those calves are often then raised in the veal industry, can be intensively confined and mistreated as well. So more broadly than the dairy industry, and related to the gathering of evidence of information that abuse is occurring, I guess related to the information. So there are actually three ways that we are able to gather that information. One is the USDA actually publishes some slaughter-related records online that we keep track of. That they do that as a result of litigation that AWI brought a number of years ago under the Freedom of Information Act. Secondly, we continue to seek public records through public records requests at both the federal and state levels, so that we're staying up to speed on what information is out there according to these records. And then third, despite the presence of these ag-gag laws, which which do, in some states prohibit things like taking photos or video of the inside of farms without permission. Undercover investigations do still occur, and we're able to use the evidence that is gathered from those investigations to support things like petitions, like the petition I mentioned, where AWI has asked the USDA to ensure inspectors are properly monitoring pigs when they're being slaughtered with CO2. And let me just mention, so related to these efforts and to animal cruelty occurring on farms, just want to circle back to the use of state animal cruelty laws. And we recently worked with another organization to petition the USDA to clarify that, in fact, in most cases, local law enforcement does have the authority to pursue these cases where animals on farms are abused or in slaughter plants, and that's not solely the jurisdiction of the USDA. So using the information we gather to pursue those types of cruelty investigations is an important aspect of our work.
Thank you, Zach. One more for you while I have you. Question here, will you be working on the depopulation approach to avian flu?
Right, so a lot going on with avian flu and depopulation these days. And from an animal welfare perspective, one of the most concerning aspects of bird flu is when domestic flocks become infected. When that happens under USDA and state policies, if even a single bird in a domestic poultry flock becomes infected with bird flu, then the entire flock needs to be killed. And that's done through a process referred to as depopulation. There are a number of ways to depopulate flocks, but there are some that are particularly cruel. One that we're most concerned about is called ventilation shutdown plus. That involves essentially sealing up a barn that may be filled with thousands or even up to 1 million birds, cutting off the ventilation and adding heaters and sometimes steam to increase the heat and humidity, and essentially over the course of the next hour or several hours, baking those animals until they die. And so it's an awful way to die. It's an awful way to kill animals. And so we're working in a number of ways to try to first prevent these infections from happening by urging USDA to require farms to use better biosecurity measures and to develop emergency preparedness plans so that farms are prepared for an infection if they occur, and prepared to use more humane methods to depopulate their flocks. And then secondly, if a flock becomes infected, we are urging USDA and states to work with farmers to have equipment available that would allow farmers to use more humane methods such as nitrogen gas, nitrogen-based foam, that is much less aversive to birds, that results in much less suffering, and can even be used more quickly in some cases than VSD plus, because VSD plus often results in a few survivors that can take days to find and kill individually. So those are some of the ways that we're involved in bird flu and depopulation issues.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Zach. We have 5 minutes. This is a question for Johanna. I live in North Carolina. How can I help the red wolf?
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. Great question. So there are a lot of different ways that you can get involved helping red wolves. So currently we have a number of various initiatives that we have that are ongoing. So there's ways that you can support underpasses for red wolves. So the leading cause of red wolf death currently is vehicle strikes. So there have been funds that have been allocated for this purpose along US 64. We do have some concerns that those federal funds are being held up. So getting in touch with your state legislators, with your federal legislators, and the North Carolina Department of Transportation, demonstrating that you are very supportive of federal funds being used as they were allocated for during the Biden administration is a great way to help. Responsible tourism is also a very beneficial way that you can go out, hopefully see red wolves in an ethical manner, going to the local area, the red wolf recovery areas, and supporting the businesses that are there, going to the Red Wolf Education Center that's run by one of our colleagues where you can see 2 red wolves and get to know more about those animals is a great option as well. And then just if you live in the area, one thing that you can do is joining the Pray for the Pack program that's run by our colleagues at National Wildlife Federation of North Carolina that improves habitat conditions on local properties to increase prey populations for the red wolves. So that's a great option as well. And if, again, you do live in the area, implementing measures to protect any chickens or other livestock that you may have through responsible animal husbandry practices reduces human red wolf conflict and bolsters support for those animals. So thanks very much for those questions and happy to have additional conversations if you're interested.
Thank you, Johanna. I think we have time for just one more question. So it's a question for Kim, following up on what people can do to help. So I think it's a great way to end this session. Other than using the AWI's Action Center, what else can I do?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So during my segment, I mentioned a few different ways that AWI's Action Center can help you go beyond just completing our actions. So those would be learning more about your legislators, sharing the action alerts with your friends and your family, and then also writing letters to the editor of your local newspaper about issues that are important to you. Another important step that you can take is meeting with your legislators in person as well as their staff. So on our website, we do have a webpage that's titled How to Communicate Effectively with Legislators, and that provides information about setting up meetings, formulating your message and your ask during those meetings, and building lasting relationships with them. One other way to get involved would be to visit your legislators' websites and sign up for their email newsletters. Oftentimes, legislators hold in-person, virtual, or phone call options for open meetings. And during those meetings, you can hear more about their ongoing work. And sometimes they do have the opportunity, give people the opportunity to ask questions as well. So those are a few additional ways you can take action beyond just the Action Center.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, 1 minute. That's it. I know we've gone through a ton of stuff. We really appreciate you joining today. Any questions that didn't get answered, you can please submit them to awi@awionline.org. And if you liked this webinar and want to see more, please also let us know that. That would be wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today.